Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook. And you can support me on Subscribestar, Locals, Buy Me a Coffee, and Substack. Today is Casual Stream 106, The Triumph of Chemistry, Firearms, and Energy. So while we wait for people to show up, I thought it would be interesting to combine two things you don't usually see. So on the one hand, you'll often have military histories, which talk about the rise of firearms. And then you might have, in a sort of industrial or mechanical manual, something to do with the chemistry involved of the gunpowder. But what you don't often see is how a sort of integrated attempt to talk about how, on the one hand, warfare and specifically missile weapons had been developing prior to the advent of gunpowder, and what a quantum leap gunpowder was. In a lot of regards, it's just something that these two separate spheres don't do, right? So on one hand, you have chemistry, on the other hand, you have history. And showing one as an overlay for the other helps quantify what's going on. And in quantifying what's going on, you can help other people see what's important. And, some people have an intuition, basic intuition, be like, okay, yeah, guns are better than bows, and they can just kind of run with that. But to actually quantify it in some sort of meaningful way helps people see, oh, wow, this is a big deal. So that's sort of the basis for this talk today, where we're going to combine, on the one hand, physics and chemistry, because we're not only just going to cover gunpowder, we're going to cover earlier forms of missile weapons and how they were used and how they differ from gunpowder, and then the effect gunpowder had with this overlay of physics and chemistry. So, without further delay, the triumph of chemistry, firearms, and energy. The gunpowder revolution in the 15th, 16th centuries is fundamentally a question of stored energy in chemistry. Prior to the advent of firearms and cannons, missiles or projectile weapons were propelled via four main methods: unaided human muscle power, tension, torsion, and counterweight. We can classify missile weapons into three categories based on the human element and how directly involved it is. We have hand-thrown missile weapons, handheld missile weapons, and mounted missile throwers. As of the present day, all three forms of missile weapons use the explosive power of gunpowder in the form of hand grenades, all kinds of firearms, and artillery, though this was not historically the case. The use of chemistry represents the application of scientific technique to war. We shall discuss the three different kinds of missile weapons, the four different kinds of propulsion prior to gunpowder, and lastly, the effects of gunpowder. The first form of missile weapon are those that are hand-thrown. That is, the force is entirely generated by the mechanical energy stored in the human body. Such weapons included stones, javelins, spears, the atlatl, slings, and boomerangs. The stone, the javelin, the spear, and the boomerang are all thrown by the human. The atlatl and slings represent augmentation by a simple mechanism. In the case of the atlatl, the use of a simple lever attached to the end of a spear to hurl it a greater distance. The sling uses a pouch and string to generate centrifugal force to propel the stone forward. Of all forms of hand-thrown missile weapons, the sling has the greatest reach and does the most damage. A slinger could have a range of 350 yards, and Plutarch describes Balearic slingers using heavy stones that could shatter Greek armor. If we measure the amount of kinetic energy communicated to the target by a javelin, an atlatl, a sling, and a boomerang, we see in the table below, and all tables are produced by Grok. So we have the javelin, the atlatl, the sling, and the boomerang. Now, what's important here is the final column, kinetic energy, which is measured in joules. The javelin has 202 joules. That's actually quite a lot for this. And then the atlatl is 91, the sling is 30.6, and the boomerang is 62.5. Now, these numbers are all going to be important when we finally get to gunpowder. Hand-thrown weapons, not doing a lot of damage except the javelin, and that's a very short-range weapon. The javelin hits the hardest because it has the larger mass, but the sling has the longer range unless larger bullets are used. While slings and javelins did continue to be used right down until the rise of gunpowder, they were weapons of limited range and or striking power. While mechanically simple, these hand-thrown missiles took years of training to use effectively. The Balearic slingers of antiquity were trained from youth to master this weapon, as did the most famous slinger of all time, the boy David. The second form of missile weapon are those that are handheld missile throwers. Originally, they were bows and crossbows. These weapons are still primarily operated by a human, where the operation of the weapon is produced by the mechanical energy stored in his body. This energy is supplemented by energy stored in the string of the bow. Bows come in 4 types: simple, backed, laminate, and composite. A simple bow is made from a single material, wood. A backed bow has a backing of sinew to strengthen the stave of the bow. A laminate bow is composed of 3 kinds of similar material, so 3 different kinds of wood. A composite bow is made up of 3 different kinds of material, such as wood, horn, and sinew. Each progression in bow design increases the level of complexity from 1 material to 2 materials to 3 materials of a similar kind to the maximum complexity with 3 unique materials. Looking at this table, the English bow represents a simple bow. The Eskimo bow represents a backed bow. A Japanese Yumi bow represents a laminate bow. And the Mongolian composite bow represents a composite bow. Now, the thing needs to be remembered is the longbow is quite big, but the Eskimo bow and the Japanese bow don't hit for very much, 35 and 45 joules respectively. The longbow is 129 joules, and the Mongolian composite bow is 110. So they're pretty comparable. Distance is not measured in the range of the projectile, and that it is assumed that the bow has a greater range by default than the hand-thrown missile weapons. The English and Mongolian bows hit far harder than anything hand-thrown except the javelin, but greatly outrange that weapon. The performance of the composite bow is comparable to the longbow because its material composition can store more energy in a smaller package. The longbow was in many cases 6 feet long, too large and unwieldy for a horseman. The Mongolian composite bow is in many cases 4.5 feet long, so basically 2/3 the size of a longbow. The bow greatly extends the range and lethality of the user. The main drawback to archery was the amount of time it took to train an archer. Both English and snub archers trained a lifetime. A further disadvantage to the composite bow was that hot and humid temperatures could cause the bow to warp and weaken the glue that held the pieces together. This is why India was not directly invaded by the Mongols, and much of Southeast Asia was able to repel their attacks. Simple bows have no such limitation. The crossbow is a tension weapon, which means the energy used to propel the projectile is stored in the drawn bow. A bow is like this as well, but the crossbow offers 2 advantages. The stored energy in the drawn bow can only be held so long by an archer before he has to release the arrow due to the draw weight. The crossbow can be held in the drawn position indefinitely through the mechanical aid of the nut, which holds the bowstring in place. Furthermore, the effort of spanning the crossbow, which originally took place by hand, can be augmented by a mechanism such as a windlass to generate larger tension force than what a man's own strength can pull unaided. The benefits of crossbows are not merely in the operation, but also in the training. A longbowman might take 5 to 10 years to train, whereas a crossbowman might take 6 months to 2 years. The main advantage of the longbow in this case was the rate of fire. Yet this advantage was not so decisive that the crossbow was abandoned. It took the rise of firearms to displace both. Now, we have 3 crossbows here. The Gastrophetes, an ancient crossbow used by the Greeks and Macedonians, the medieval crossbow, and then the arbalist. The Gastrophetes hits with 35.6 joules of energy. At the time, that was kind of insane, but by the Middle Ages, it's not quite so good. The crossbow hits for 122.5, so it's in the range of, it's a little bit more than a Mongolian composite bow and a little bit less than a longbow. And the arbalest hits for a whopping 225 joules. That's even more than the javelin, and that's because the arbalest is a heavy-duty crossbow. We see that even with the Gastrophetes, an early ancient crossbow, the force generated is highly comparable with bows we looked at before. The medieval crossbow and arbalest deliver force equal to or greater than the bow. The Crossbow stands in a middle ground between bow and guns, and that represents the drive towards a sophisticated mechanism more akin to a siege weapon than a bow. This drive towards mechanism and complexity can be seen as proto-scientific spirit in war, whereby reason, art, and technique are blended into a mechanism, which is a force amplifier to the user. The third form of missile-throwing weapon is mounted missile throwers. Prior to the advent of gunpowder, these were powered in one of two ways, torsion or counterweight. Torsion power is derived from the stored potential energy of sinew or hair bundles formed into twisted ropes that are released to swing either an arm, such as an onager or mangonel, or release the bow arms of the ballista or scorpion. Counterweight power uses the potential energy of a large box filled with rocks, sand, or lead to release the energy. The trebuchet is like a giant sling, where instead of a man using centrifugal force to propel the bullet, a large counterweight does. The onager and the trebuchet both rely on a throwing arm to propel a stone projectile, whereas the ballista and scorpion looks like a scaled-up crossbow and can throw either a stone or arrow projectiles. The use of ballista as field artillery and their powerful hitting capacity is illustrated in two examples: Alexander's crossing of the Jaxartes River and Belisarius' defense of the city of Rome. Arrian's Alexander the Great, Book 4, Chapter 4. When the skins had been prepared for the passage, and the army fully equipped had been posted near the river, the military engines, at the signal preconcerted, began to shoot at the Scythians raiding along the river's bank. Some of them were wounded by the missiles, and one was struck through the wicker shield breastplate and fell from his horse. The others, being alarmed at the discharge of missiles from so great a distance and the death of their champion, retreated a little from the bank. But Alexander, seeing them thrown into confusion by the effect of his missiles, began to cross the river with trumpets sounding, himself leading the way, and the rest of the army followed him. Procopius, History of the Wars, the Gothic War, Book 5, Chapter 23. And at the Salarian Gate, a Goth of goodly stature and a capable warrior, wearing a corselet and having a helmet on his head, a man who was of no mean station in the Gothic nation, refused to remain in the ranks with his comrades, but stood by a tree and kept shooting many missiles at the parapet. But this man, by some chance, was hit by a missile from an engine which was on a tower at his left, and passing through the corselet and the body of the man, the missile sank more than half its length into the tree, pinning him to the spot where it entered the tree. It suspended him there a corpse, and when this was seen by the Goths, they fell into great fear, getting outside the range of missiles. They still remained in line, but no longer harassed those on the wall. Now, if we look at the kinetic energy produced by the onager, the ballista, and the trebuchet, we see much higher levels, because torsion power and counterweight are a lot more effective than just being thrown by hand or tension. The onager delivers 12,250 joules, the ballista 4,537 joules, and the trebuchet a whopping 101,250 joules. So obviously trebuchets aren't very accurate, and they're really only used in siege warfare, but that is powerful. And if we look at the ballista here, we can see why Alexander and Belisarius could use these weapons to literally just shoot right through a man. A longbow could, given accounts faced in the Welsh Wars by Edward I, could go through a man's leg, through the horse, and through his other leg. So that's pretty nasty. But that's usually not armored. And an armored man, you'd have to get really close to penetrate, and you wouldn't go through both legs, unlike a catapult. We can see that the two arm-based siege engines produce more force than the ballista, with the trebuchet producing more energy than both the onager and ballista, nearly 10 times the onager. To sum up, we have three types of missile weapons based on their relation to the user: hand-thrown missiles, handheld missile throwers, and mounted missile throwers. With each iterative development, the force produced by the human is augmented by mechanical advantage. Tension is the energy stored in a bow, torsion is the power stored in twisted ropes, and the counterweight is the energy stored in a heavy weight that is released. This is where warfare stood in the 15th century. Gunpowder would change all of this. It also needs to be said that the trebuchet is 22 times more powerful than a ballista. That's ridiculous. While developing independently in China, the earliest account of gunpowder in Western sources dates to the mid-13th century. Gunpowder was the result of a mixture of saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur. Roger Bacon gives a formula of something that sounds very much like gunpowder in his Opus Maius and Opus Tertium. The first confirmed use of gunpowder on the battlefield was the French at Crécy in 1346. By looking at the work of Walter de Milleme, 1326 to 1330, we see early depictions of cannons, which provides evidence for gunpowder being used in siege warfare. This is a quantum leap in energy use. We jump from mechanical energy in the form of siege engines to chemical energy, and the leap in power generation is astronomical. This will be illustrated by comparing the pre-gunpowder missile weapons, the longbow, crossbow, onager, trebuchet, and ballista on the one hand, with the arquebus and the culverin on the other. So if we look at this, we see the longbow is again 129 joules, the crossbow is 122.5 joules, and the arquebus is a whopping 1837.5 joules. I mean, this is just a quantum leap over everything that came before. And this number alone would explain why ultimately even primitive guns, and we'll get into some other problems, would replace these. Now if we look at siege weapons, we have the onager, which we already said produces a little over 12,000 joules. The ballista, about 4,500 joules. The trebuchet, a whopping 101,000 joules. The culverin, a incredible 367,500 joules. I mean, wow. This table is striking in that the force generated by gunpowder is orders of magnitude greater than tension, torsion, or counterweight force. The arquebus generates about 14 times more force than the longbow or crossbow. If we compare the training times, 5 to 10 years for a longbow, 6 months to 2 years for a crossbow, and 3 to 6 months for an arquebus, we not only see a massive leap in lethality, but a massive drop in training time. This drop in training time is in large part the result of the nature of the chemical reaction. Man has removed himself almost entirely from the process of force generation. So therefore, the actual training is minimal. He's not really doing the work here. He really is only the initiator of the process, which works under its own principles. We see a gradual elimination of importance of the individual in this process, moving from the bow to a mechanism in the crossbow, and finally to a chemical process. The only other chemical process comparable to gunpowder was Greek fire, a medieval flamethrower. The nature of the concoction ensured it was of limited use on land and even at sea highly volatile. With regards to mounted missile throwers, the most powerful medieval siege engine, the trebuchet, was approximately 9 times more powerful than an onager and 22 times more powerful than a ballista. Yet it is outperformed by the culverin by 3.5 times. The culverin was a much smaller engine and easier to move and produce than a trebuchet. Again, this cannot be stressed. This is night and day. So if going back to the analogy the historical account of Alexander's army and Belisarius' army, pinning a man to a tree or shooting through his armor with a ballista, a culverin would just literally blow him to pieces. There wouldn't be anything left if he got hit straight by that thing. It's a little bit unlikely because it's not as accurate, but still, I mean, there's not going to be much left if that thing hits you. There were many problems with early gunpowder weapons, including but not limited to accuracy, explosion of gunpowder stores, explosion of the firearm or cannon while in use, and slow rate of fire. Yet in spite of all these limitations, gunpowder offered more firepower and shorter training times. In addition to tactical advantages, there were social and political advantages to the use of gunpowder. After the Black Death, when European populations recovered in the 15th and 16th century, European populations were rising. This produced a pressure to more effectively utilize that population in order to be more competitive as a state. One way was to equip larger armies. This is where the arquebus comes in. You can train more men in less time than your opponent who was using longbows or crossbows. This also has a social dimension. James Madison, Federalist number 46, and advocating for the right to bear arms as a hedge against tyranny, states, notwithstanding the military establishments in the several kingdoms of Europe, which are carried as far as the public resources will bear, the governments are afraid to trust the people with arms. And it is not certain that with this aid alone, they would not be able to shake off their yokes. While he is speaking of firearms in the 1780s, the longbow in the 15th century served a similar role. It was for this reason that Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire chose not to use large bodies of archers. They feared the upending of the social order. Guns at this time were a centralizing force. The maintenance of gunsmiths and arsenals were expensive and best performed by the central government. This strengthened the state at the expense of the people and the aristocracy. Castles were no longer proof against the state, and nobles lost a great deal of their autonomy. The rise and dominance of the state in these centuries was reinforced by the state's ability to capitalize the production of firearms and cannons in a time where smaller social organizations could not. While in the short term, gunpowder has a centralizing effect, in the long term, it had a decentralizing democratic effect on society. With the rise of firearms, the end of a military caste in the form of the aristocracy occurred. When a peasant could kill a knight, the whole dynamic changes. Many more revolutions in firearms technology would have to occur to get us to Madison in the 1780s. Nonetheless, the process by which this would occur was already set in motion. Furthermore, as states sought to raise larger armies, they would have to find some way to get the common man to become invested in the cause, much like the yeoman soldiers of classical Greece and Rome. For example, in the 18th century, most soldiers in European armies were impressed men, often convicts and criminals. This meant that they had to be kept on a short leash, away, always in sight of their officers, lest they desert or rob the populace. A common attribution of Frederick the Great was, "I want my soldiers to fear me more than the enemy." This shows us the nature of employing convicts and criminals. In the French Revolution, with the levée en masse, in the French Revolution, you had a highly motivated and indoctrinated army that could be trusted with independent action and decision-making. While the Romans had this form of army 2 millennia before Napoleon, the use of gunpowder in modern times aided this development. The battlefield effects of gunpowder were most felt with the earliest form of missile weapons being gradually phased out as they lacked the striking power of guns. The supremacy of the English longbow was decisively challenged by French artillery at the battles of Formigny in 1450 and Castellane in 1453. In the first case, 2 culverins were positioned to attack the English line. The harassing fire provoked the English bowmen to charge their guns and silence them. This provoked a wider melee in which the French men-at-arms prevailed. Castellane was a battle which resulted from an English sally from a besieged city. The French had dug in lines of circumvallation and had placed at a minimum 100 guns to besiege the city. When Talbot launched a sally to break through the weakest point of the French lines, the attempt was a forlorn one, and the English columns were shot to pieces, with Talbot being mortally wounded in the salvos. David Nicole calls this battle Crécy in reverse. We see that through the use of field artillery, the French were able to utilize the same tactics as Edward III, the Black Prince, and Henry V, but with culverins. In light of the previous charts, we see that the force generated by the culverin vastly exceeds that generated by the longbow. 367,000 joules versus 129. No contest. The reason why the English had to advance in both Formigny and Castellane is that sitting and taking it would be suicide, as they had lacked any form of counter-battery fire to silence the French guns. It also turns out charging them was as well. Though, at least in theory, they could have taken the guns and shut them down. That was the only option they had. The English During the Italian wars of the 15th and 16th centuries, the French scored a major victory over the Swiss pike blocks at Marignano in 1515, and the Spanish, utilizing arquebuses, scored a major victory over the Swiss at Bicocca in 1522. Both battles are covered in my The Tales of Two Military Revolutions, Part 2. The only weapon in the Old World that had continued use until the bayonet in the 18th century was the pike, a non-missile weapon. In short, militarily, socially, and culturally, the world was changed forever by the use of gunpowder. To summarize, we can speak of 3 kinds of missile weapons: hand-thrown, hand-held, and mounted. There are 4 ways to power such weapons before gunpowder: unaided human power, tension, torsion, and counterweight. In all cases, the energy input is from the human operator, with each iteration making use of increasingly clever forms of mechanical advantage. With gunpowder, the input for the force output is almost entirely chemical, with the human element minimal. The 4th generation with gunpowder was a quantum leap in lethality, which in time displaced the issues of accuracy, rate of fire, and accidents would displace all forms of missile weapon except hand-thrown, which would turn into grenades. Military culverins helped France win the decisive battles in the Hundred Years' War against England and later Swiss pike formations, and the Spanish utilized the arquebus to equal effect against the Swiss. The high cost of production, along with siege guns, favored state formation, and that the nobles lacked the funds to keep up or defend their castles from siege. Over time, it had the democratizing effect of empowering the people against the government. In social terms, when a hastily trained peasant could kill a knight, it spelled the end of the military aristocracy and served as a radical leveler. Furthermore, democratic tendencies arose from the nation states seeking to give the populace skin in the game in order to conscript them. Okay, we have a full chat today. We have Jeff, we have Middleton Walker, Medi, and not Salmonfish. Hello, all. All right, let's see what we got in the chat. Middleton Walker, interesting how the destinies of entire peoples can so entirely be contingent on these technologies. Yeah. Medi, what weight would the projectile be normally? I think the weight is described in the panels. I don't know which weapon you're talking about. Excellent presentation. Well, thank you. Middleton Walker, I confess, is pretty opaque to me, but I like to listen anyway, and I think I get the basic idea. Well, you don't have to necessarily understand the physics or the chemistry. The entire point here is to give a visualization through quantifying the force power of these projectiles to show you why guns ultimately won out. If I scroll back up to this chart, it's pretty obvious why guns won out. I mean, 367,000 joules. That's insane. Nothing even comes close to that for the culverin, and then for the arquebus. Yeah, that's a handheld weapon. That's ridiculous. 1,800 joules. It's a real game changer. Seeing Missile Blaine, be glad you're not on the battlefield up close to the realities of the kinetic. Exactly. Well, everyone, that's the end of the presentation for today. Make sure to check out my earlier videos on the medieval revolutions, because they're all sort of related to this. So, yeah. Thank you for tuning in, everyone. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.